Hello everyone, Spider Fanboy here to bring you an entirely new series. I know it's been a while since I've been away. I was just taking care of it was just a whole bunch of stuff, and mainly I was just procrastinating on making any new videos. I'm not going to be continuing with the What If Hinata was on Team 7 for a while. I want to put that on hiatus until I can come up with a much more concrete script for it. At least I want to get it down better. So for now, I'm just kind of doing this one out of mainly just pure curiosity. It kind of just hit me one day, so I wanted to try it out. This is going to be a My Hero Academia and Pokemon crossover, and it is what if Deku was Mewtwo, or basically if he had Mewtwo's powers. Quick note here: he's gonna essentially look like shiny Mewtwo, which has a green coloration instead of the normal purple. It's part of what actually inspired me to make this. So yeah, we're just gonna go on from there. So basically, we're gonna have it start. His origins are gonna be a little different from Mewtwo's in the actual Pokemon series. Essentially, in this story, this is how we're gonna start it. One day, uh, Midoriya Izuku was born, uh, and instead of just being born as the normal quirkless human as we all know him, he was instead born with a peculiar appearance. It was quite obvious right off the gate that he was a mutation type. He had a small feline-like body with smooth features, a light green coloration towards the entirety of his body, a very long, thin tail, and an overall he almost looked like a small hairless cat. Essentially, he's gonna start off actually looking like Mew, um, and Mew's own shiny is blue, but I'm gonna have it instead be that lighter green coloration that Mewtwo has for his main body. So, like how normal Mewtwo is kind of two-tone, he has like a softer, really light lavender skin, and then his tail is where it's really dark purple. But for his shiny, instead it's like a soft greenish white, and then his tail is a darker green. Here he's gonna have that whole softer light green tinted kind of coloration to him, and that's how he's gonna look like as a Mew. Um, and very quickly he shows off his psychic capabilities. When he's born, he's obviously born crying, but people are a little initially thrown off by his very obvious mutation. Inko still loves her son; it doesn't matter to her, but it's her husband who has the interesting reaction. At first, he doesn't really care either. He's just happy that his son is has been born nice and healthy. But when in the middle of the night, as he's being held in like the maternity ward, or not the ward, the ward where they keep all the babies, the nursery, as he's being held in there over the night, giving him his checkups and wanting to, especially since he's just a randomly born mutation. It does happen occasionally. Sometimes you'll have children who are born with completely different quirks than either of their parents, or there's some odd, unforeseen mix of them, or they're just born with their own original mutation. So they're kind of like running through the usual kind of checkups that they do in these kind of situations. And Hisashi himself, being a scientist, wants to have a bit of a look. The the hospital staff is a little unsure about letting him, but once they recognize his credentials as a lead researcher in quirk analysis and quirk researching, they quickly allow him to, with a little bit of money too, he waves around a little cash, and they allow him to get a look at his charts, make sure that he's properly healthy. And at first it really is just pure fatherly concern, but as he looks into it, he notices quite a few things about his quirk factor. It's very odd how seemingly malleable, how almost alien like his son's DNA is. Sure, quirks can be quite strange. They can provide with a whole litany of superpowers. They can make some people just look like talking slime, but it's quite interesting how random and sudden this transformation and this sudden mutation came about. He's quite curious. But he doesn't think too much of it until just a few hours into the night when Izuku wakes up crying and he sends out a shockwave of pure power. Um, Objects start glowing, various other cribs start floating, but luckily the that has been watching were able to get things to calm down. They have one of them probably has a quirk, like a lullaby kind of quirk, that is able to quickly put them all to sleep. And Izuku is put to sleep, and they're able to escape with no casualties, no injuries to any of the other newborns. But it is noted that his son is already quite powerful. So they quickly move him to a more private ward where Hisashi himself ends up once again stepping into the situation. He starts watching over, although he does quickly check in with Inko to let her know what happened, and he reassures his worry wart of a wife that he's got this. He's going to be keeping an eye on Izuku personally, and if anything does happen, he'll be right there to help him out. Which does put her heart to rest, and she's able to go back to resting because yeah, she was pushing a Mew out of her womb. So yeah, she definitely she struggled. But once again, as Hisashi, he lets his wife go back to sleep, and he's watching over his son privately, and he's very, very intrigued. He had very rarely seen children, let alone a newborn, activate their quirk in such a manner. Um, Not only activating it so quickly, literally hours from being born, but being able to do so to such a degree. He nearly lifted some of the nurses up as well. If any of their testimonies were to be believed, it could have been just hysteria, but well, he had seen how many objects were shaken up. Some of the cribs were cracked. They had to be very careful in moving the newborns to newer cribs and trying to put them back to sleep. But at this point, he is very invested into his son. And as time moves on, the years go by, and eventually we get to a 4-year-old Izuku Midoriya. And this is where I'm making another change. I've decided to make Izuku 2 years older than he is in canon. So essentially, he's around Mirio's age. He is now the proud older brother to a young Izumi Midoriya. And yeah, I am adding in a gender bent Deku because I want to. Basically, at this point, his sister is around a year and a half younger than him. She was born, I would say she was born around the time he was around 1.5, maybe 2 years old. So that does give him that almost 2-year gap between the two of them. His younger sister noticeably looks much more human. And as Izuku goes into school and he's initially somewhat outcasted for his odd appearance, but it's not long before he begins to show off his powers, his ability to move objects with his mind as he does things like writing, as he writes down things using his psychic powers, or moves objects like toys and sticks and twigs on the playground. He helps push his classmates on the swings using his psychic powers, and whenever someone's about to get hurt, say they're roughhousing a bit too much, or they're playing on the playground and or climbing some trees, doing some stupid kid things, and they're about to fall, he's able to quickly catch them. He becomes a little hero known throughout his classroom and by his teachers. And he actually becomes somewhat popular, but he is still the same, similar, like kind of shy, soft-spoken young man. And he doesn't really try to let it get to his head, because throughout his entire life, especially since he's become an older brother, he has been told that he wields a great amount of power, and he has to be very careful with how he uses it, especially by his father. He's always told him that he was special, and at first he just thought that that was his way of reassuring him, trying to get him to see that, just trying to make him feel better about the fact that he looks different from everyone else. But as he begins to meet some classmates that have their own mutation quirks, he begins to see that his father was right. He's just another special boy, different in his own way, and there's nothing really wrong with that. Unfortunately, this good outlook on his father is not going to continue. One day, when he's out escapading with some classmates of his, after school, maybe when he's around 5 or 6 years old. At this point, his own little sister has recently not only started to attend preschool, but or she's just starting to attend school herself, but she's also been diagnosed as quirkless, and it has caused a bit of a rift between his family, specifically with between his two parents and his father's outlook on their daughter. He doesn't necessarily seem to hold any kind of negativity towards her, but he does seem to be disappointed that she didn't have any kind of spectacular ability. Izuku's powers have grown, and he knows for a fact that his father does hold love for his daughter, for his sister, but he also knows that he's kind of in the wrong. He doesn't exactly agree with his father's assessment of Izumi, and he is a little upset, and he does bring this up with him. But Hisashi ends up explaining that in his mind, or he ends up explaining his views, that he thinks that in this world, with how things have changed over the centuries since quirks first appeared, that power is very essential, and Izumi has been born with a very distinct disadvantage. It's simple fact. She's probably not going to be able to go far. And this actually ends up resulting in Izuku kind of blowing up at his dad in a very literal sense, exploding with psychic power and actually actually knocking his dad back, which upsets Izuku. He didn't mean to actually hurt his father, but Hisashi just waves it off. He says that it's fine. He understands that he feels strongly and protective about his sister, and if anything, it's very important that he remains protective of her. He needs to do everything that he can to ensure that nothing ever happens to her. Izumi, from now on, is his greatest responsibility. And this is what is going to be staying in Izuku's mind for the rest of his life. One day, when Izuku is around 7 years old, his father ends up receiving a promotion with the company that he's working with. He does a lot of private analysis and research on quirks for a various number of services, from providing analysis on very big public villains to sell the information to various heroic agencies, so he can be sometimes hired on as a consultant, to assisting with various schools, whether they be heroic or non-heroic, so that he could help provide some type of not exactly quirk counseling, but he does provide data and information that he gathers from people's quirks. And sometimes he even does one-on-one jobs where he's hired by someone to help them figure out their quirks. If there's some kind of aspect that they may have misunderstood that may have affected their life in some kind of way, blah, 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 blah. Basically, if this kind of Hisashi was around in canon, there's a good enough chance he would have been able to help out Toga Himiko and help her figure out her quirk instead of learning to repress it and eventually having her psychotic break. He kind of does those kind of work for more one-on-one clients and helps young students who may be struggling with those same kind of problems. But eventually, he ends up agreeing to take the wrong job. He ends up being called by a very mysterious benefactor through a connection he has with the local doctor. A Dr. Tsubasa. Apparently, he's the grandfather to one of Izumi's classmates, a young boy with bat wings as his quirk. Deciding to trust the doctor, he is a bit of a pediatrician, and he helped provide the diagnosis for his daughter, even if he didn't exactly agree with the cold way he went about it. He might also share his views that the quirkless are very clearly at a disadvantage, and they're probably not going to go far, but at the end of the day, that's his daughter, and he's very protective of her. He didn't exactly appreciate how she was put into tears because of his words. He also doesn't exactly appreciate the way Inko went about handling things, but he can't exactly say he's been any better. Things have been getting a little difficult in with him being able to bond with both of his children after his little argument with Izuku and his overall distancing from Izumi. He's really going to have to figure out some way to help to try to fix this mess, but first he has to help his client. This client ends up, of course, being All for One, although he simply presents himself as Mr. Shigaraki. Eventually, he has him, start off just doing some analytics. He introduces himself as a bit of a quirk enthusiast. He's done a lot of research himself, and he's always been a bit more private and eccentric with his lifestyle. and he wanted to see Mr. Midoriya's views on a series of quirks that he's been working with. Very specifically, there's there are quirks of some not clients. Uh, I'm trying to think of the word. I can't believe I'm blanking on it. Some people that work for him. Uh, some of his employees. There we go. I can't believe I blanked on that word of all words. But he brings up that he has a few employees that he wants some work, that he wants them to do some work for him. But he'd like a professional's opinion on the synergy of their abilities. And so, over the course of a few months, they end up having a bit of a back and forth. And with Mr. Shigaraki paying quite handsomely, and with the analysis seemingly being for innocent reasons, even if they are being kept secret, he doesn't really mind. He can't really think of any kind of nefarious intention this man has. And while he does consider the possibility, as he does with all of his clients, that maybe he's being manipulated, he really just can't seem to find anything on Mr. Shigaraki that's too dirty. If he is a villain, he's very good at keeping himself clean, and unfortunately, that just so happens to be the case. Eventually, Hisashi ends up being brought in on more and more projects, and actually gets to meet him one on one. And as time goes on, he ends up bringing him on projects. He wants to do projects revolving around further studying of quirks and genetics. And at first, it really doesn't seem all that bad. He just takes him to a few patients that are in actuality some potential successors that he has, or people that are being prepped to become Nomus long before the fact that are also being deceived at the same time. So he's able to kind of keep the veil over Hisashi's eyes for quite some time, until eventually he ends up ripping the cloth free, and he ends up blackmailing Hisashi when he comes clean with it all, and he tells him that, oh no, he's far too deep now. He has a number. All for One has a number of enemies, and if any of them were to find out that Hisashi helped him in any way, shape, or form, well, there's a good chance that some organizations, like the HPSC, the Safety Commission, might want to just make him disappear, just for the sake of simplicity. They are not exactly believers in proper justice. They just want issues to be dealt with. And Hisashi Midoriya might just be presented as an issue if he were to, say, manipulate some evidence, make use of some blackmail, some images that may or may not be entirely real, some audio files that may or may not be entirely real, then Hisashi's going to be in a pretty bad spot, especially that family of his. And this gets Hisashi, firmly on his payroll. He doesn't want to risk his family. And over time, as the months go by, he begins to distance himself more and more, until Izuku ends up trying to figure out. He tries to stick his nose into his father's business. At around 8 years old, Izuku decides to just risk it, and he actually makes use of his psychic powers to peek into his father's mind. It's an ability he had been working on through playing guessing games with all of his classmates, making use of his powers to simply lightly intrude on their thoughts. And it was very simple, what kind of number am I thinking of? And he was able to train his power without risking getting caught. But eventually he ends up finding out what happens, and when he does, he ends up confronting his father in private about it. He understands the need for secrecy, but he wants to help his father. But Hisashi won't have it, and he ends up announcing about a week later that after finally getting Izuku to keep quiet about it, at least for now, he does promise him that, okay, we'll figure something out, we'll get to the authorities, but we cannot risk this. We can't put your mom and your sister at risk. Remember, Izumi is your biggest priority. She is your greatest responsibility, and you have to keep her safe. So we're going to put this on pause for now. And as the week goes by, he ends up announcing that he's going to be moving overseas, and that he wants to take Izuku with him. At first, this elicits a pretty bad reaction from Inko and Izumi, but he quickly clarifies that he's received a job offer, and he wants to bring Izuku along for the first month. to kind of he wants to kind of give Izuku a bit of a peek into his job and his work. He figures that this will be a way to keep Izuku close and make sure that he doesn't do anything reckless when he's not around, as well as a way to keep All for One's attention off of the rest of his family. He knows it's a risky move, but he also knows that to a man like All for One, Izuku is probably the second most, if not the most valuable asset that he sees in the Midoriya family, aside from himself. While his analysis is pretty good, his quirk isn't all that great, just a mere fire-breathing quirk. But Izuku is absolutely amazing. His potential is still unscratched, and he knows for a fact that All for One has his eyes on him. He's made a few passing comments about Izuku, and while a part of him doesn't want to risk it, the logical part of him recognizes that Izuku is probably his biggest and greatest weapon. He's his best way to kind of keep the attention away from Inko and Izumi. If he has Izuku with him, All for One will be more focused on the both of them, instead of just being focused on Inko and Izumi. So this way, he's able to somewhat keep the two of them safe. It's not a perfect plan, but when you're dealing with someone like All for One, who has eyes and ears everywhere, it's kind of the best that he can come up with, and especially with Izuku trying to pressure him into rebelling, this is kind of the best that he can come up with in such a short amount of time. And when they do end up moving, they do not move overseas. They instead move onto a more remote island that is owned privately by All for One. And this is where All for One reveals himself to be the absolute Machiavellian mastermind that he is. When they initially move into the facility, because of course it's just the facility. They don't really have anywhere else to live on the island. It's just the facility there, where they're making new forms of Nomus, where they experiment on quirk users in an attempt to awaken their quirks so that they can add those awakened quirks to their Nomus. They're trying to essentially work on some high ends. They're trying to develop high ends in a kind of new way by working with just a few awakened quirks instead of a whole like half dozen or a whole dozen of quirks. Maybe instead they'll only have like 3 or 4 awakened quirks to make them powerful. It will still strain their minds, but perhaps if the host is used to the process, if they're able to survive the intense process of awaking or evolving their quirk, they'll be able to handle the strain of maybe 1 or 2 normal quirks to further boost them in strength. Basically, they're just working on quirk evolution and how that might benefit the Nomus and All for One in general. So in this facility, Hisashi and Izuku are essentially held hostage. All for One reveals that he was aware of their plans. He had a different form of he was able to keep some surveillance on them using a type of psychic quirk that allows him to kind of watch over people, kind of like almost like a crystal ball. He's able to kind of conjure an image in his mind when he thinks of 1 or 2 of maybe like a few people that he's marked. Essentially, he was able to kind of spy on them without needing to make use of any kind of technology. It was through the use of a type of psychic quirk. And he was aware of Izuku finding out about him, and he was aware of their plan to try to keep Inko and Izumi safe. But as he ends up sedating the both of them, although he does actually end up, his enforcers do kind of get into a bit of a struggle with Izuku, as he does try to fight back, but he does promise them Inko and Izumi Midoriya are not at all his concern. He has 2 very valuable prizes here already. And he actually ends up having to put down Izuku himself, making use of a gravity quirk to kind of increase the weight on Izuku. And it kind of shocks him when Izuku is just able to stay floating there, although he can see his body glowing and struggling and shaking and trembling midair. His red eyes glowing with power, with his psychic power and his blue aura surrounding him. But eventually he does, as Izuku tries to fly forward through the increased gravity, All for One is able to hit him with an air cannon that kind of shakes him off guard. Izuku tries pulling off a whole new form of he tries pulling off a whole bunch of tricks that he's learned, that he's practiced in private. A small ability to teleport short distances, but it ends up not working when All For One just expands the range and usage of his quirk to affect everyone in the area except for him. And when Izuku notices that this is actually crushing his father as well, he quickly stops in a worry. He tries to go over to him, tries to make use of a healing ability he's recently managed to learn. But he doesn't get to heal his father for more than a few seconds before he is eventually knocked out by All For One, and he is imprisoned. And Hisashi is essentially forced to start working on the Nomu projects, and he attempts at every turn. He tries to find some way to find his son, as he's been kept in isolation away from him. But eventually he gets his answer after about 8 months, where he's had to make calls home in order to reassure his wife and Izumi that, oh, Izuku is perfectly fine. He's just with some new friends that he's made, or he's working on some homework over here that I'm having him do, or he's having so much fun learning things here. I think he really might end up following in my footsteps and become a quirk analyst. And he has to put up these fake smiles on the clone, and he has to put in this fake amount of joy. And inadvertently, he ends up bonding with Izumi, assuring her that Izuku doesn't want to avoid her. He's just always a little busy. But his brother loves it. His brother loves her, and he loves her, and they actually end up bonding despite this harrowing situation. And Inko is constantly worried, but she always gets pictures, and they always get letters from Izuku, telling them about how much fun he's having, and so they're able to have their worries are soothed. And at every turn, every single time he tries to find out what's happened to Izuku, All For One will taunt him with just a little nugget of information. Oh, he's taken to the modification so well, or your son is quite powerful. He's quite clever. He's so very intelligent. He's very creative with his abilities. I can't wait to see what'll become of him. And eventually, he's shown after around 9 months of absolute torture on his end, he ends up learning what's happened to his son when he is brought in to see the newly created Nomu, the M2. Yeah, not creative at all, but I don't really care. The M2 Nomu, and when he's taken to him, he sees how his son has changed. His body is, despite having only initially been 9 years old, and he was still pretty short. He hadn't really grown all that much since he was 4 years old. But now he had suddenly shot up in size, in mass. His shape had changed quite drastically. And essentially he now looks like how that, what was that Mewtwo special that showed his, if you search up baby Mewtwo, you'll know what I'm talking about. Kind of what he looks like in the Mewtwo origin story. It was like a short film, or a special that came out a long time ago. It explained his origin, and he literally just looks almost like a chibi Mewtwo. So he has a smaller body but bigger than he was as a Mew. And obviously he's in his shiny variants. He looks like a shiny Mewtwo, so he has the green tinted gray skin with the green underbelly and tail. He has that little thing that kind of connects to at the back of his neck to his head. But yeah, he basically looks like a baby shiny Mewtwo at this point. He's in that iconic pose, held up, suspended in the glass tube, and as all the scientists, specifically Dr. Tsubasa, who he has learned about and is very angry with, and at every turn he's tried to prevent himself from just setting the guy on fire whenever they're in the same room as one another. But they all begin congratulating themselves, while Hisashi just kind of stands there in horror, and eventually All For One kind of just pats him on his shoulder with that dark, condescending grin, and he says, "You should be proud of your son, Hisashi. I do believe we might have just created the most powerful being in the world, and he's all mine now." And as Hisashi's own rage and anger begins to build, um, various screens begin flashing, various numbers are popping up, showcasing that the subject N2's brain activity has started to spike up. The energy readings are beginning to go off the charts, and All for One's grin actually begins to kind of. He's not sure whether he should kind of keep up his grin or if it should begin to slide off his face, as eventually Izuku's eyes end up opening, and with an explosion of pure power of psychic energy, the glass is shattered. It's sent flying everywhere, and it kills nearly every doctor except it kills almost everyone in the room. The flying glass. Tsubasa is protected by All for One. All for One protects himself, and surprisingly enough, all of the glass shards completely flow around Hisashi. Not a single one ends up making any kind of impact with him, and it's not at all on All for One's doing. Izuku ends up kind of rising to his full height. He looks at himself in complete disbelief before staring at All for One. All for One tightens his grip on Hisashi's shoulder, and he tries to tell Izuku, he tries to warn him, "I would be careful if I were you, young Izuku. You wouldn't want anything to happen to your dear father, or your family, your mother, and your dear little quirkless sister." And before he could even begin to finish, both Izuku and Hisashi are seemingly teleported away. And this kind of stuns him. Immediately he brings up the same kind of surveillance quirk that he used to psychically keep track of the both of them. But he finds that his psychic markers are completely gone. He can't see them. Not at all. But that doesn't mean he doesn't have a contingency in place. He tries to use his various warp quirks, specifically the one that teleports people to him, the kind of vomiting liquid warp quirk that we saw him use on like Bakugo and the League of Villains during the Kamino incident. He tries to use that quirk, but it doesn't work either. It seems, he mutters to himself, that young Izuku has somehow managed to cancel out my quirks. He's completely cleaned the both of them. They're unbugged. How interesting. I wonder how he did it. But he is left with no more time to contemplate. The two of them are wild cards and can't risk anything happening. So he tries. So he ends up opening a warp gate that he had recently developed from a recently made Nomu, Kurogiri. Yeah, we're bringing him in just briefly, small little cameo. And suddenly a black smoky cloud appears in front of him, and he brings along the doctor as they step through it. They're brought into a base on the mainland of Japan, and he ends up contacting his various subordinates, telling them that it's about time that they take hold of the Midoriyas. It seems that Izuku and Hisashi have gone rogue, so it's time to pay the other two a visit. But when he ends up having his various spies and goons that he has like positioned in the area of Musatafu, like around their apartment, he tries to check in with them. All he gets is static, missed calls, nothing goes through. Eventually, after almost half an hour of absolute radio silence, he decides, screw it, I'm not risking a weapon running on the loose like this. So he just teleports directly to their house, which luckily he does have the address of, so Kurogiri can make use of the coordinates to open up the warp gate. They end up teleporting there. They end up trying to knock on the door, but or at least they would have if it weren't for the fact that it's seemingly a crime scene. Luckily, they didn't go just right through the front door. They teleported a few blocks away to keep themselves safe. And they end up noticing that it's a literal crime scene. It seems like there's bodies all around the block that they were living on, and even a few blocks down there are other cop cars pulling up to various scenes, various houses, various rooms, and cheap hotel rooms and apartment rooms, various small homes that had been rented out. And he notices that these were all the various safe houses and the various locations he had each of his men to keep an eye on the Midoriya family. He ends up disguising himself, and he walks into the crowd, making use of some of his persuasion quirks to ask what exactly happened. And he's able to get some information that apparently there was some kind of bright flash from the house before before a whole bunch of random people kind of just exploded out of nowhere. And this catches his attention. So it seems like that his Izuku was able to retreat here, making use of his teleportation ability. He wonders just how far the boy's range has increased. They were a good couple. They were a good couple dozen kilometers off of the coast. It was a very privately owned, small little island that was not on any maps. He made sure over the centuries to essentially erase its existence. So he's very intrigued as to how he was able to know his location. Like he wonders, like just how exactly his own teleportation ability works. But he doesn't have too much time to ponder. He has to find the Midoriya family. They know too much, and the boy especially is very dangerous. But as months go by, he's unable to find Izuku Midoriya. He's unable to find a single shred of him until he ends up having his battle with All Might. At this point, we're 5 years before the initial meeting in canon between All Might and Izuku, so at this point, Izumi herself is 8 years old, where canon Izuku would be 8 years old, and our Mewtwo Izuku is around 10 years old. So it's been about a year. It's been about a year at this point since the Midoriyas has seemingly gone missing, and All for One is kind of just in the middle of his battle with All Might. And at first, things seem to be going a bit back and forth. He eventually ends up getting to the point where he goats All Might into another blind rage, and he's about to land a particularly nasty combination of quirks that he's sure that if it won't outright kill All Might, it'll definitely cripple him, take out a whole bunch of vital organs. But before anything can happen, suddenly, a bright flash appears on the battlefield. The two of them end up stopping in their tracks, or at least All for One does, as he almost instantly recognizes this odd alien presence that has appeared. But it's much more dangerous than he could have ever anticipated growing to. All Might himself doesn't stop his charge. He plows All for One right in the face, but it's not quite the killing blow that he wanted. All for One was able to throw up a few quirks, a few defensive barriers, and a few augmentation quirks to make sure that he didn't get his head completely blown off. He ends up kind of dashing away from the scene, and Gran Torino himself steps in to stop All Might and to focus on the new arrival. And they see this odd feline-looking creature. They're not sure if it's some kind of experiment of All for One's, a weapon, some kind of bioengineered monster. And at first they do think it's on its side, especially when it's doing nothing but staring down All for One, and All for One is staring back. But they very quickly notice, Gran Torino specifically notices, that something is very off. And that becomes apparent when the creature charges towards All for One and begins doing battle with him. It begins, a bright blue glow begins to surround all of the surrounding debris. Chunks of destroyed buildings, wrecked cars, even things like rebars, sewer grates, mailboxes, railings, everything, bus stop posts and everything, benches, they're all turned into projectiles to throw against All for One. The pieces of metal are warped and turned into long lances and spears and sharp-ended points so that they can pierce through his various defenses. Any kind of attack that he attempts to make, any type of attack that All for One attempts to make, shooting out various streams and balls of fire, water, ice, some kind of toxic liquid, is all countered as this creature is seemingly able to replicate these abilities. It throws out various gouts of fire of its own, various blasts of electricity. Just sometimes it seems to just be nothing but pure energy that it throws out. Occasionally, its body will glow with some kind of different colored energy. Sometimes it's a blue, sometimes it's white, sometimes it appears as though its limbs are encased in metal. As it begins to physically plow through any kind of attack All for One tries to put in its way, It'll send out shock waves of electricity, of sound, of energy, earth, rock, everything. At one point, it seems as though it's conjuring a storm, as thunderbolts begin to rain down onto the ground, and um, eventually ends up shifting into a proper storm, starting as rain as it begins to, shoot out gouts of water, pulling it not just from the atmosphere, but pulling it from the sewer grates and the nearby plumbing system, before shifting to hail as it begins to throw various pieces of ice, whether it be shaped as beams or shaped as large structures that it forms, giant drills, constructs, chains, everything it can think of to try to chain down his opponent. And multiple times, All For One seemingly tries to teleport away, making use of his various teleportation abilities. But every time it does, it's seemingly trapped within some kind of barrier surrounding the battlefield. At this point, All Might and Gran Torino are wondering just what the hell is going on as they maneuver around the battlefield, avoiding being avoiding being caught up in any kind of debris, and trying to interfere in the battle, only to be teleported around by the creature whenever they try to get a hit on All For One. They eventually manage to shout at it at one point. Gran Torino gets very expletive with his words, gets a little nasty, and just tells the stupid green cat that they're trying to help. They're trying to take this guy down too, which gets it to briefly pause as it's kind of barraging All For One and keeping him pinned down with a mix of high pressure water and a literal storm of ice and lightning. It turns to stare at them with one eye, and it seemingly, for a brief moment, they can feel some kind of odd spike in their head before it turns back towards the battle and it stops interfering with them. It stops teleporting them away from the battle, but it's not exactly holding back any punches, and occasionally they have to get out of the way so that they don't get hit. But they are able to kind of pin All For One down, and All Might is able to get in that final hit on his head. Brain matter, he gets that final hit on his head that would turn him into Mr. Potato Head in the future, but as All Might is standing over this absolutely battered, bloodied, and bruised corpse, or at least what he thinks is a corpse, he is surprised when out of nowhere the creature teleports directly in front of him, hovering directly over the laid out body of All For One, and it surrounds the body in a glow. Both Gran Torino and All Might are wondering what it's doing, and Torino actually tries to zoom in on the scene, only for the creature to seemingly squish its 3-finger hand into a small fist, and the glow completely compacts the corpse into a small, mangled mess of tattered clothes and hamburger meat, basically. It then drops what's left into back onto the floor before seemingly parting all of the clouds as the sun begins to shine, and that shine begins to envelop the creature. It begins charging up a large amount of energy, initially just appearing to just be a glowing ball of golden energy, only for flames to begin surrounding the creature as the two of them begin to retreat, wondering just what the hell is it doing now, and then channels all of that fiery energy directly at the corpse and incinerates it into nothing. And finally it begins to speak. You will never come for my family again. And with that, it ends up dropping the blast completely, releasing all of the energy and incinerating everything within a 10-20 meter radius, trying to keep the destruction down, but also not wanting to give this absolute monster of a man the chance to ever come back. And with that, things begin to calm down. The creatures teleports away before Gran Torino and All Might are able to do anything but watch on. They can't get to it in time, and it seemingly teleports away. And over the course of the next following months, as both All Might and Gran Torino try to dedicate their forces to trying to investigate the creature, they eventually stumble upon a household that had been unoccupied for some amount of time. and had only recently been repopulated by the family that had once lived there, the Midoriya family. And when they arrive, it's as though they were expected. The combined, the small group that ends up arriving consists of those in on the secret of One for All and All for One. All Might himself, Gran Torino, his longtime mentor, and the friend of his predecessor and master, uh, Tsukauchi Naomasa, a member of the police force, and who they hope will help with the interrogation and getting some answers on everything. Um, long time, and who's also a longtime friend of Toshinori's. Sir Night-Eye, the one who initially started the investigation and was able to find a good amount of was able to find a few leads here and there that he initially couldn't connect until their most recent member, Nezu of UA, the current headmaster, was able to piece everything together and assist them in their search for this very mysterious creature. They would have had their other member, David Shield, or even Recovery Girl, but Recovery Girl is, of course, constantly on duty at UA, and she probably wouldn't have been too much of a help. Whereas David Shield is too busy with iExpo, although they were able to collaborate with him on one of their leads, a certain Hisashi Midoriya, a Quirk analysis that had seemingly gone missing about a year and a half ago, that they couldn't really find any information on until he recently popped back up in his old family home. Apparently, his whole family had gone missing when he had tried looking up what had happened to his occasional colleague. Not exactly friend, but they had worked on a few projects together. But nonetheless, he was curious to see where the soul went, and he had lent what knowledge he knew about the man to his friend. As they end up showing up at the door, it is opened by a young, green-haired girl with four freckles shaped in the diamond pattern on four on each cheek. She ends up opening up the door, freezes at the sight of All Might, and completely begins to geek out. Before she is called back by her mother, who also completely freezes at the sight of all of them. And two in particular, Gran Torino and All Might, freeze up at the sight of her, wondering, why the hell does she look so much like Nana? Why the hell does she look so much like Nana Shimura? But eventually they're able to shake that off when a black-haired man with similar freckles and curly hair steps in, holding a cigarette in between his lips and saying that they had finally arrived. This gets both Izumi and Inko to snap out of their awe-enhanced trance at the sight of All Might and turn towards Hisashi with very similar worried but also somewhat calm looks. There's a level of anxiety, but it's tempered by something that they don't know the source of, until the creature arrives, seemingly floating through the wall itself. They all turn their attention towards the creature, and as the family begins to settle at the sight of it, they wonder just what its ties are, until the little girl walks right over to it, hugs it, and claims it as her, and calls it her big brother, Izuku, which gets them all to wonder, oh, that's a human. What an odd mutation. Eventually, Izuku ends up speaking to them, making use of his psychic abilities, speaking to them telepathically, telling them that he knew they were coming, he knows what they want, and he'll tell them everything. But they're not allowed to harm anyone here. Night-Eye, kind of being a little worried and suspicious, asks what exactly will he do if they don't follow through with that promise. And as the family gets worried, with Hisashi himself actually breathing out a small puff of flames from his nostrils, that everything is stopped cold when that same psychic blue aura surrounds each and every single one of the strangers. And he tells them that he'll do the exact same thing he did to All for One if they even think about threatening his family. Nezu is able to kind of step in here as everyone is kind of waiting with bated breaths, and he tells them that they don't have anything to worry. They have no intentions of harming him or his family, but they do want answers. If he can help them, they'll help him in return. With that, his aura, his little hold over them breaks as he lets them all go and says that they should sit down and have some tea, which Inko ends up preparing for all of them. They all have a sit down. Now Masa makes use of his lie detector quirk, which isn't actually a thing, by the way. He's called like the Truth Man or whatever. That's like his little nickname that they mention. But here's the thing: his sister from the Vigilantes manga, the manga that ends up explaining how Shirakumo is Kurogiri, and gives us Aizawa's backstory. That's where we learn that his sister has the lie detector quirk, and we also end up learning that one of Naomasa's ancestors also has a lie detecting quirk. But Tsukauchi Naomasa's own quirk has never actually been stated. For all we know, he's quirkless. Now, it's likely that he has some kind of truth detecting quirk or lie detecting quirk, but we don't know for sure. But for the sake of simplicity, we're going to say that he has a lie detecting quirk and he's able to and a truth, or actually, we're just going to say he has a truth one. So, kind of changes up the rules. He can tell if you're telling the truth, or if you're telling a lie. Basically, that's what we're going to give him. He can tell if you're telling the truth or telling a lie. But if you say something intentionally misleading, it becomes a little more muddy. Thankfully, Izuku is kind of direct with his answers, and so is Hisashi. They end up explaining the whole situation, how Hisashi was roped into All for One schemes, and how Izuku learned of All for One's existence, and how the two of them were held against their will. The rest of the family doesn't seem surprised. Inko and Izumi do seem very somber, and Izumi kind of clambers in between her brother and father, laying her head down on kind of Izuku's lap and trying to hold both of their hands, occasionally shifting over to her father to give him a big hug, which gets all of them kind of like, oh, were you made aware? And they end up explaining how when Izuku managed to break them out, he teleported them directly to their home, expanded his aura, and then briefly teleported away, leaving Hisashi to try to explain things before he returned covered in blood. He ended up... Oh, give me 1 second. Let me get myself a drink of water. Oh, man. Okay. He ends up explaining that Izuku was able to make use of his powers to... apparently his psychic powers had been bolstered by whatever experiments they did on him. His abilities, they just can't be categorized as one singular quirk. It's almost like he has multiple, but he's checked his quirk genome. He's checked his DNA. The thing is that he doesn't have a singular additional quirk. Everything was just him evolving to adapt to each of the experiments that they put him through. The various experiments were usually tests of his abilities, finding out the range and how far he could push them, and how he would react to certain outside stimuli, effects of other quirks, being forced to fight against failed nomus and the like. His abilities just evolved to adapt to each and every single quirk he encountered, finding ways to not only counter them but to replicate them and make them better, fusing them without actually having to take in any kind of additional quirk from All for One. He learned from seeing other people use their quirks, and he was able to advance his own biology just by being around other people. And he had unintentionally been limiting himself. He had only ever thought his powers were psychic based, so throughout his early childhood he only ever developed psychic abilities. The abilities to manipulate things, move them with his mind, read minds, things like he would see in magic tricks where they would teleport around, where they would seemingly teleport around, all that kind of stuff. But he had never thought, since he never really thought he could do anything else, he never would have been able to do anything else. But it wasn't until he was put into situations where he wished he had this or that power to help him out, and he began developing them, that he and all the people participating in the experiments, all the other scientists, learned what kind of limits he really had. This didn't exactly work out for them, as he ended up reading All for One's mind, went through his list of quirks that he had and all the quirks that he had gone through throughout his centuries of living, and in their time hiding away, he had managed to replicate a whole number of quirks, dozens and dozens of them, merging them into a whole series of powers that he could use so that he could catch All for One off guard and eliminate him. Which does once again shake up all the heroes, and obviously puts tears in Inko's eyes and Izumi's as well, although it seemed as though Izuku saw where the conversation was going and actually put it to sleep before she could hear any of the more nasty bits. And he does confess he very much killed All for One's enforcers that he had spying on them, and he killed the scientists on the island. He made sure that he knew who he killed, and none of them were innocent. He even ends up telling them about Tsubasa, or Dr. Garaki, as he's better known, the right-hand man to All for One. Tells them about they're gonna want to investigate him at Deku Hospital, and he ends up giving them a whole bunch of information in regards to All for One's various plans. He tells them about how he had a whole bunch of other lined up successors, and he basically gives them all the information that he has. And he ends up settling on two pieces of information that he had gathered to be the most recent. One of them was about a boy he had been grooming for a good few years, ever since the boy was around 5 or 6. If he's right, the boy should be just a few years older than himself, not probably only in his mid to late teens. The both of them should be, which gets them both confused. They're asking, who are these two potential successors you're talking about? And he says that one of them has taken up the name of Tomura Shigaraki, but his birth name is Tenko Shimura, which gets them frozen up, and which gets them all frozen up. And as he continues, he says that the second one has taken up the they've been keeping loose tabs on. They've kind of allowed to go free. Has recently taken up the name Dabi from their most recent intelligence, and was the firstborn son of Endeavor, Toya Todoroki. That they're gonna wanna find those two very soon. Kind of put a stop on all of that. They don't need two potential All for Ones coming out of the woodworks, because if they cause problems, he tells them outright. He doesn't care who they're connected to. He's going to kill them. If they pose any kind of threat to him, if they come after him seeking revenge, or just wanting to take down someone who as powerful as him, he's going to kill them. He's not going to hold back. He doesn't care whatever kind of backstories that they have. His responsibility is his family, his sister. He's not going to risk anything. After that, he ends up kind of leaving the room with his sister, setting her down for bed, as the parents are kind of left to do damage control at the fact that their son just threatened two upcoming villains that have murdered. At this point, I would say Dabi probably has murdered a couple people, and we know Tomura went back to go. We know Tomura killed those thugs that beat him up, which honestly fair enough, but still a murder. And if Izuku can use that as justification outside of I need to protect my family, in order to protect his family, he'll use it. He doesn't care. At this point, his family is his only concern. He hasn't entirely given up on his want to be a hero, but in his mind, the only person who he needs to be a hero for is his sister. That's the only person he cares about. That's the person he cares about most in the world. He knows his parents will always view him as, their son, especially with Hisashi having formed a very massive amount of guilt revolving around their situation. He's tried to help him out, tell him that, he made his own very admittedly stupid decisions to get involved, and that it wasn't entirely on him, but Izuku very, very clearly disagrees. Anyways. at this point, yeah, at this point, things would end up beginning to change, even further. So I think I'm going to leave it off here. I was obviously kind of rambling for this one, and that's kind of just what I wanted to do, get this kind of idea out of my head. Um, so that's where we're gonna leave off, with that little nice little threatening moment of Izuku just being an absolute willing to become a monster to protect his family. So at this point, he has, instead of being completely the results of an experiment, he's actually started off as a Mew, albeit one that had not at all come close to realizing his full potential before being kind of like how in Ultimate Alien, in Ben 10 Ultimate Alien with the Ultimate Tricks, you get the ultimate forms by putting the initial alien DNA sample through simulated Armageddon for like 10 million years. He was essentially put through life-threatening situations over and over and over again over the course of months, constantly fighting against his various lackeys, failed Nomus, and occasionally a successful Nomu. Not quite to the level of, say, the USJ Nomu, but dangerous ones nonetheless. That would be decent enough struggles for most heroes, and some of the failed higher end Nomus um, were definitely very dangerous, each in their own individual way, and they all forced him to develop specialized abilities. Kind of again making use of the fact that Mew's DNA is the progenitor of kind of all Pokemon DNA in the world. He kind of started off as the ancestor to them all, and similarly to how his DNA is capable of adapting to make use of any kind of move ever, Izuku's DNA was able to adapt in response to outside stimuli, changes in environment, and even opponents that it would recognize as predators, and develop abilities either to initially counter theirs or adapt so that it could become the better, more superior versions of their abilities. So let's say if he was occasionally put against a Nomu that's abilities completely revolved around being able to breathe fire at it, initially it would develop abilities that would completely make it so that Izuku was completely resistant to any kind of changes, extreme changes in temperatures that would increase it. So basically it would become completely heat and fire resistant at first. Then it would develop that into being able to either put out those flames, so it might develop water-based abilities, or it would develop the ability to, say, consume or absorb fire through any different kind of method by like absorbing the thermal energy of it, or straight up going Natsu Fire Dragon Slayer style and just breathing in the flames and eating them, and like breathing them back, kind of like maybe he would think like, if I was like that, I could breathe the flames right back at him, and then he'd develop flamethrower, and just from that one move, he would be able to become a pyrokinetic, and it just began to evolve from there. He began learning how to make use of his psychic energy to enhance his physical capabilities, so he could learn fighting type moves, practicing things like basic karate chops, or moves where he would like, if I could break this boulder that this Nomu is throwing at me, I'd be able to be completely safe from it. And he ends up developing things like Brick Breaker or whatever, where he's like, if I could just beat it down quick enough, beat out its regeneration or shock absorption or whatever, and then he ends up learning attacks like Extreme Speed or Quick Attack or Close Combat, all that kind of stuff. And of course, he would want to be able to heal himself, fix all of his injuries. He had already kind of been working on that, like I hinted to beforehand. So he ends up learning moves like Roost or Rest, all that kind of stuff. He ends up, yeah. He ends up developing things like electric type moves, blah blah blah. Basically, as he began fighting, he just became stronger, and eventually his body had to forcefully evolve itself into his Mewtwo state, which is going to be permanent from now on, in order to be able to handle all of these powers that he was just rapidly developing. There's a good chance he just would have been able to grow into it naturally, but he was forced to do so over the course of like 9 months, and then he spent like another 9 months on the run, developing his powers with his family in secret. And he was literally just kind of teleporting them around to kind of random people's houses, kind of mind controlling them, temporarily rewriting their memories, so that the Midoriya's were always a part of their family, but they have to keep them a secret because that's just how it's always been, until eventually they would end up moving on. And when he ended up, and he even learned how to replicate the quirk All for One used on them, and managed to plant that same kind of psychic bug on All for One, so he could keep a spy, so that he could keep an eye on him. And when he learned that he was fighting against All Might, he ended up teleporting onto the scene to help wipe him out. He also ended up planting that bug on Torino and All Might, which is how he knew they were coming. He knew that they were investigating, and he chose to settle back in with his family over the course of time after the death of All for One. And let me actually real quickly make this perfectly 100% clear. The original All for One is dead. But his minions are not. Gigantomachia still exists. Dr. Kuraki is still out there, although who knows how long that may still hold true. He may end up retreating if he finds out one way or another that Mewtwo was involved in the death of his master. He may try to focus himself on the development of, say, Shigaraki. Or he may go another route, might try to find Dabi. But again, who knows how long he might be out on the run by himself. But, yeah. That's where we're going to leave things off for now. So, All Might's little inner circle, they're now aware of the Midoriya family. They're going to be keeping an eye on them. They have a good few leads, but who knows where that's going to take them. Zuko himself doesn't really want to get involved anymore. While he would like to kill the doctor, he knows that they would probably rather interrogate him, and he just doesn't have the patience for that. So he's choosing to distance himself and his family away from the problem completely. Instead, he's going to be focusing on guiding his little sister and looking for ways to protect her in ways that will not get him arrested or give him some kind of record that might have other people looking into his business, which he does not want. He doesn't care if they're part of the government, some kind of shady organization, or if they're literally aligned with religious. He just doesn't care. He's going to keep her safe from everything and everyone that he can. So we're going to see where that path takes him in the next part. So if you liked everything you saw here, like, comment, subscribe. Comment down below what you did or did not like. And I'll see you all in the next video. This is your friendly neighborhood Spider Fanboy signing out. Bye-bye.